Our presenter today, Dr. Yulia Richard. Dr. Yulia Richard holds a professional doctorate in clinical and health psychology, with postgraduate qualifications in psychology, counseling and psychotherapy, and applied psychology. She is an associate member of the Australian Psychological Society, a member of the Australian Clinical Psychology Association, and a committee member of the APS Interest Group for Culture and Psychology. Her clinical and research interests include developmental issues, well-being, stress and anxiety, relationships and conflict resolution, grief and loss, culture and psychology, health psychology, emotional intelligence, and organizational psychology. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Yulia Richard.
So hi everyone and welcome. It's really great to see so many of you are here. My name is Dr. Yulia Richard, and for the last 15 years my work has been dedicated to understanding impulsivity, moving away from my doctorate research into clinical practice and more recently focusing on professional training. I'm so glad to share some of the insights with you today. So today we are going to look at impulsivity not as a single trait or isolated behavior, but as a multidimensional process shaped by emotion, reward, neurobiology, stress, development, and context. We will explore why this remains such a debated clinical challenge, looking specifically at the mismatch between competing brain systems. We will also look at a critical paradox, how the same mechanism that drives dysfunction can also be a source of adaptation, creativity, and survival. And finally, we will address why insight alone so often fails to create a lasting change by tracking how impulsivity moves across diagnoses from addiction to emotional reactivity. We can begin to see that external behaviors are merely the surface expression of much deeper process underneath. And take a look a moment just to see on your screens an overview of the key areas we will be exploring today. So under enough emotional urgency, human beings become temporarily short-sighted. Not stupid, not immoral, not weak, simply short-sighted. The brain begins prioritizing relief over reflection, certainty over accuracy, escape over consequence, and that changes behavior dramatically. Suddenly, the angry outbursts make more sense. Binges make sense, affairs, gambling, cocaine makes sense, self-sabotage makes sense. Not because behavior is healthy, but because the nervous system is attempting to solve something very quickly. So we are going to explore what actually happens in these moments. But before we move into research and prevalence data, I want to briefly ground this in your personal experience. I'm inviting all of you to reflect honestly on your own experiences as well. Do you have difficulties concentrating or sustaining attention? Do you sometimes act fully before fully thinking things through? Are you more impulsive under stress or strong emotion? Do you find urges, cravings, temptations difficult to regulate at times? And do mood shifts make you more likely to act impulsively? Do you struggle with boredom and restlessness? And are you sometimes drawn toward novelty, stimulation, or excitement? Do distraction easily pull your attention away from what you were intended to focus on? These are just some of the more common indicators that impulsive control may be playing a role in someone's life. And you will often see these patterns not only in yourself, but in your clients as well. And just out of interest, just you can raise a hand or respond with a reaction. How many of you actually answered yes to any of these questions? Yes, so many of us occasionally or often might be struggling with some of the aspects of impulsive behavior as well. And now, if impulsivity were a disorder in its own, it would already represent one of the largest mental health concerns in the population. A national study of more than 34,000 adults found that nearly 1 in 6 people report clinically significant impulsivity. And when we move into clinical population, estimates suggest impulsivity becomes elevated in roughly 40 to 60% of psychiatric presentations, including or depending, or just hold on a second, I just redo this last sentence. And when we move into clinical populations, estimates suggest that impulsivity becomes elevated in roughly 40 to 60% of psychiatric presentations, depending on the setting and population being studied. But what makes the statistics particularly striking is where impulsivity shows up. The study linked it to suicidality, aggression, violence, risky decision-making, substance-related problems, trauma exposure, and major psychosocial impairments, which means we are not talking about rare or isolated issue. We are talking about a process that repeatedly appears across some of the most emotionally charged, costly, and self-destructive areas of human behavior. And one of the interesting tensions in this field is that despite impulsivity being linked to so many significant behavioral, emotional, and clinical outcomes, there is still no single universally accepted definition of what impulsivity actually is. Across the literature, there is a strong consistency. Impulsivity has been described as behaviors that are poorly conceived, premature, inappropriate, and that frequently result in unwanted outcomes, or acting on the spur of the moment without adequate planning, or tendency to deliberate less than others before taking an action. And a more comprehensive formulation described it as a predisposition toward a rapid, unplanned reaction to internal or external stimuli without regard for the consequence. And building on this, Moller and his colleagues identified 3 core features: a tendency to persist in behavior despite negative or absent reinforcement, preference for smaller immediate rewards over larger delayed rewards, and difficulty inhibiting or withholding response. Taken together, impulsivity reflects a behavior that is rapid, minimally deliberated, and biased toward immediate outcome, with reduced inhibitory control and limited consideration of long-term consequences. In reality, many impulsive patterns emerge in ordinary, everyday moments, often automatically, and sometimes without us fully recognizing them. So the next question becomes, how do we understand it physiologically? So let's move into some of the major psychological models of impulsivity. From a personality perspective, impulsivity is conceptualized as a relatively stable trait. It means that individuals differ systematically in the baseline tendencies, particularly in reward sensitivity, novelty seeking, and tolerance for the delay. These differences influence how quickly a person moves toward an action across situation. For example, even after repeated dead and broken trust, the pattern can persist. You feel a rush of a fresh paycheck. You tell yourself that you're just browsing for an item, but you see 50% discount poster. And the impulse overrides the history of conflict you just had with your partner. By the time you get home, the emergency card has been maxed out, the thrill of purchase is gone, and replaced by the familiar anxiety of upcoming argument. So from cognitive perspective, the focus shifts from decision-making process. Here, impulsivity reflects limitations in executive functioning, especially ability to pause, evaluate consequences, and maintain goal-relevant information in working memory. And the key point is that the difficulty lies not in knowing, but in accessing and applying that knowledge in time. And just like when your boss asks if you can work overtime or if you can work on a weekend, and almost automatically without thinking, you're saying, yes, I'm available, without checking your diary, without consulting with your partner. And at the moment, it feels good to feel appreciated, to feel needed, to feel relied on. And later on, you check your calendar and you realize that you already promised to pick up your parents from the airport. And now you feel frustrated, resentful toward your boss, annoyed at yourself for grieving so quickly again. And from behavioral perspective, impulsivity is defined by observable pattern, the emphasis on response inhibition, whether an individual can withhold or delay an action when required. So this is why impulsivity is often measured through task assessing premature response or failure to inhibit dominant responses, and just like in that case. And you are driving or sitting, for example, at an important meeting, and almost automatically you reach for your phone to check notification, even though a part of you already knows that you shouldn't be doing it. And I want you to note as well, maybe even during today's webinar, how often you might find yourself reaching for your phone to check notification or just simply to scroll. So even after that conflict and regret, the excitement of sale overrides reflection in the moment. Likewise, automatically checking your phone or saying yes too quickly reflects the behavioral and cognitive difficulty inhibiting automatic responses before they occur. And as you reflect on your own routines and decision making, where do you notice this pattern emerging? Maybe you just notice where that energy shows up in your own personal life. Each perspective isolates a different component of the same process: baseline tendencies, moment to moment processing, and observable action, making impulsivity more accurately understood as a multi-layered process operating across these levels simultaneously. And that is a framework we will use as we move forward. If you take this one step further, impulsivity has a very clear clinical relevance. Let's take a look at impulsivity across clinical presentations. Impulsivity is recognized as a transdiagnostic risk factor across multiple conditions. It is embedded within diagnostic criteria of a number of disorders in DSM-5, including binge eating disorder, alcohol use disorders, borderline personality disorders, ADHD, intermittent explosive disorders, and others. And in practice, it means that impulsivity is often a core underlying driver that runs through so many of complex cases we see in general psychological work. But impulsivity is not limited to clinical population. It can also appear in individuals who would not meet diagnostic criteria. So while we might associate impulsivity with conditions such as intermittent explosive presentations, mood instability, or substance-related difficulties, the underlying pattern itself is much more widespread. For example, impulsive anger can show up in everyday contexts. Think about road rage, bursts of explosive anger, or other reactions to everyday incidents. And while you may only occasionally burst into anger, it can still become an issue for you. And despite clinical importance, validated impulsivity measures are not routinely incorporated into standard intake protocols. We consistently diagnose and treat conditions in which impulsivity is a defining feature without looking at it at a much deeper level. And that is a training gap. And today's webinar, that is what we are trying to address as well. So let me give you two clinical presentations. At first, we have Andrew, 41 years old, presenting with escalating stimulant use and impulsive risk-taking behaviors. Over the past 2 years, his work has become more relentless, more responsibility, constant pressure, less sleep. One Friday night, after exhausting week, he stops for drinks with his colleagues. One drink becomes several, and at some point, someone in the group offers cocaine. He hasn't touched it since university. He's not particularly keen, but he decides to give it a go. He tells himself that just like one night, not a big deal. But over the following months, the same pattern quietly repeats itself whenever the pressure peaks. Over time, the other behaviors begin clustering around it. Impulsive online trading, withdrawing money from joint account, horrible sleep, he starts an affair. His judgment becomes purely reactive to escape pressure. The drug use is discovered, he loses his job, he loses his career and his marriage. Now he's sitting across from you and saying, honestly, I don't even know how life unravels so quickly. And now we can compare it to Michelle, 34 years old, presenting with emotional dysregulation, binge eating patterns, and chronic self-control difficulties. There is no addiction crisis or major collapse. She maintains her work, relationships, and day-to-day functioning relatively well. But over time, quieter impulsive patterns become visible. After a difficult day at work, she repeatedly orders large amounts of takeaways, and then she regrets it later. She tells herself she will stop impulsive online shopping, but during stressful weeks, packages keep on arriving at her house. At home, she becomes emotionally reactive in arguments. Every couple of months, there is another moment where she feels that she has lost control. And then life settles and continues. So this highlights that impulsivity is a transdiagnostic process. While Andrew's presentation is acute and destructive, Michelle is quieter and a bit more normalized. Impulsivity is operating in both lives. It is simply manifesting in different intensities across different behavioral domains, often disguised as a separate clinical issue. To understand why Andrew loses his job and his marriage, while Michelle just loses her temper, we have to look at the utility of the impulse itself. Consider a moment where you made a rapid decision without overthinking it. Maybe spontaneously you started a conversation with someone and found the love of your life. Maybe you applied for an opportunity on an impulse or took a chance you would usually talk yourself out of it. And years later, you realize that the brief decision altered the direction of your life. That action was impulsive too. And this becomes the entry point into work of Scott Dickman, who argued that impulsivity is not a single uniform trait, it has two different faces. Impulsivity is not inherently pathological. In the right context, the capacity to respond quickly can become a major adaptive advantage. And that is what he described as a functional impulsivity. We see it in trauma surgeons, elite athletes, emergency responders, and entrepreneurs, leaders navigating high-pressure situations with incomplete information. These individuals are often able to translate rapid perceptions into effective action without being paralyzed by over-deliberation. Neurocognitively, the distinction is not simply fast versus slow responding, but whether the behavior hits the demand of the environment. But the challenge emerges when the same drive for immediacy loses its contextual fit, becoming what we would define as a dysfunctional impulsivity. This is our primary clinical target. Acting quickly when the more adaptive response would be to pause and to tolerate the discomfort. Whether it manifests as binging, spending, emotional outbursts, these actions rarely random. From a regulatory perspective, they are high-speed attempts to escape emotional overload, shame, or distress. Now, there has been some debate around it. Some scholars argue that if a behavior is adaptive or effective, it should not be classified as impulsivity at all, because impulsivity is typically associated with poorly regulated behaviors and negative outcomes. But when we are sitting across from a client, Dixman's distinction is incredibly helpful. It moves the conversation away from why can't they stop toward a much more useful question. In what context has this system been shaped to operate, and where does that no longer serve the individual? Impulsive behaviors often do not initially present as a clear problem. They can appear situational, occasional, and manageable. But over time, without interventions, the consequences tend to accumulate. It can include difficulties in academic or occupational functioning, increased aggression, interpersonal conflict, patterns of substance use, risky behaviors, financial strains from unplanned spending, maybe gambling, and maybe high stakes investments, and health related impacts such as weight gain or persistent pattern of saying, I knew it better, but I did it anyway. So the key point here is this: impulsivity is not a single behavior, diagnosis, or personality flaw. It is a multidimensional, transdiagnostic, self-regulatory process involving emotion, reward, inhibition, stress, and decision-making systems all at once. And we also seen that impulsivity exists on a spectrum. In some contexts, rapid action can be adaptive, flexible, and highly effective, and in others, the same drive toward immediacy becomes very costly. And importantly, impulsivity cuts across both clinical and everyday life, shaping presentations as different as addiction, binging, reactive anger, overspending, relationship conflict, and quieter self-regulatory struggles people experience every day. So we can move to the second part of our webinar, starting with the pain and pleasure principle. We've looked at impulsivity from different perspectives, but there is one more context that becomes particularly important in practice, and that is the psychopathological context. When impulsivity becomes severe and more persistent, it starts to affect judgment and forethought in a more significant way. This is where we see it linked to behaviors such as aggression, self-harm, high-risk decisions, often in the context of emotional dysregulation. What is important here is that the behaviors are not random. They tend to follow a fairly consistent pattern, which is often described through what is called pain and pleasure principle. At a basic level, behavior is shaped by two things. We move away from discomfort, we move towards a reward. In impulsive behavior, the focus shifts from seeking pleasure to managing urgency. It isn't a ritualized compulsion, it is a high-speed mechanism used to terminate acute internal tension, such as stress or high arousal excitement. Now, closely related to this is the idea of immediate versus delayed gratification. Impulsivity tends to show up as a bias toward what is available right now over what might be better later, especially in the moments of heightened emotional or physiological arousal. And this is captured by the concept of delay discounting. What that means is that the value of a reward drops as the delay increases. So even if long-term outcomes objectively better, it starts to feel less relevant if it's not immediate. So research indicates that we can identify critical risk factors remarkably early in our treatment process. A study of over 200 people in addiction treatment found that their discounting rate at intake accurately predicted who would stay sober, who would relapse, and who would leave the program completely. It is a powerful predictor that works before therapeutic relationship has even been formed. So the reason these scores are so predictive is linked to a specific cognitive deficit, reduced capacity for episodic future thinking. For these clients, future rewards, such as a long-term health or stable relationship, it's not just distant. It is often not psychologically real or emotionally accessible at the moment of choice. So that's why simply telling someone to think about consequences often fails. You're asking them to use a cognitive capacity that is just not available to them, especially under stress. So the question then is, if people cannot connect with the consequences of their behavior, how can we help them to overcome their unhelpful behaviors to build future they want to live in? So the early research focused on behavior, reaction time, response inhibition, and whether someone could stop themselves before acting. But research quickly realized that impulsivity is not just about stopping. but often it is about waiting. So Walter Mischel asked a very simple question. Can a person tolerate a gap between wanting something and having it? And that is what led to what many of you already know as a marshmallow experiment. Walter Mischel placed children in front of marshmallow and told them that they could eat one right now, immediately, or wait about 15 minutes and they're going to receive two instead. So follow-up studies suggested that children who waited tended to have better educational and social outcomes later in life, making it one of the most influential studies in developmental psychology. However, later replication work by Tyler, Waltz, and colleagues showed that the effect was much smaller than originally believed and far more influenced by environment rather than willpower alone. So once factors like caregiving, family stability, and socioeconomic conditions were counted for, the long-term predictive effects weakened considerably. So interestingly, as the paradigm has resurfaced in popular culture recently through a snack challenge. You might have seen it on TikTok or Reels on Instagram. And basically, a parent leaves a treat in front of a child and tells them not to eat it, and they walk away. And the reaction is fascinating. Parents often feel a surge of pride if the child waits, viewing it as a sign of a good character, while there is often an underlying anxiety or disappointment and judgment if child eats it immediately, as if it is a sign of a problematic child. And this is not a test of a character. Children who do not wait are not failing. They're simply demonstrating in a miniature as a neurobiological process we see in our clinical work. And this matters now more than ever. We are living in an environment that is specifically designed to eliminate delay. Every notification, every infinite scroll, every one-click purchase is engineered to collapse the gap between wanting and having it. So when we sit across from our clients, we have to remember, we are not just working with individual impulsivity. We are working with people trying to navigate a world that is constantly reinforcing it. So when immediate relief consistently wins, behavior begins to organize around speed, eating, spending, reacting, whatever reduces the discomfort the fastest. And over time, these patterns stop feeling like choices and they start functioning as automatic regulation. And by adulthood, we're often not treating a habit, but a well-reinforced system for managing internal states. So I want you to consider this question. If impulsivity is the engine behind so many of our clients' most destructive behaviors, how often are we actually looking under the hood at how the engine is built? To understand impulsivity at mechanistic level, we need to look at how specific neural systems are functioning. At the center of this, we have mesolimbic dopamine system involving the ventral, tegmental area, and the nucleus accumbens. So the system is responsible for incentive salience. It detects cues and assigns them a motivational value. In practical terms, it determines what stands out and what feels relevant and what generates an urge to act. So importantly, dopamine activity here is less about pleasure itself and more about anticipation and drive, the wanting signal that precedes the action. So alongside this, the prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral and ventromedial regions, support the regulatory functions. It includes maintaining goal representation, evaluating outcomes, delaying responses, and modulating behaviors based on context. These systems operate in a continuous interaction. In higher impulsivity profiles, what changes is not the existence of the systems, but the balance and timing between them. So the system is not impaired globally, but it becomes state dependent, meaning under neutral conditions, regulation may be intact. But under load, it becomes less reliably available at the point of action. This results in a very specific neurobiological pattern where salient signals are amplified while regulatory input is not consistently deployed in time to shape the behavior. So, from this perspective, impulsivity is not best understood as a failure of control. It is better understood as a temporal mismatch between systems. And one of the clearest ways we understand this regulatory system is by examining what happens when they become disrupted. So let's take a look now at impulsivity in the context of traumatic brain injury, frontal lobe dysfunction, and neurodegenerative change. Let's look at a case that has become central to how we view and understand self-regulation. Phineas Gage was a railroad foreman working in Vermont in 1848. During routine blasting work, an explosion propelled an iron tamping rod through his skull. The rod entered below his left cheekbone and exited through the top of his head, passing through portions of the frontal lobes. Remarkably, he survived the injury and was conscious shortly after the accident. What makes this case clinically significant is what followed next. Gage retained basic cognitive abilities. His language, memory, general intelligence, all of it was largely preserved. But what has changed was his behavior in everyday context. Accounts from his physician described a clear shift in temperament, judgment, social conduct. He became more impulsive and less consistent, and less able to plan or anticipate consequences of his conduct. For what it was, he became notoriously unreliable and poorly regulated in everyday decision making. Later analysis links these changes to disruptions in prefrontal systems involved in decision making and behavioral regulation. His colleagues reported that, in their own words, he was no longer Gage. One brain region, just one injury, and the man they knew was completely gone. The same type of impulsive behaviors do not only emerge in a sudden traumatic injury. We can also see them appear gradually in neurodegenerative disease as frontal system begin to deteriorate over time. So impulsivity becomes highly relevant in conditions such as behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. Unlike disorders initially defined by memory decline, this condition first presents through dramatic changes in personality and behavior. Families may describe someone becoming impulsive, socially inappropriate, and emotionally insensitive, financially reckless and sexually disinhibited, or maybe even aggressive in ways that feels profoundly unlike the person they once knew. These behavioral shifts strongly linked to degeneration in frontal and orbitofrontal systems involved in behavioral regulation. We see something similar as well in Parkinson's disease. Although Parkinson's disease is primarily recognized as a movement disorder, some patients develop major impulse control difficulties such as gambling, compulsive shopping, binge eating, hypersexuality, and particularly when dopaminergic treatment amplifies reward sensitivity while weakening inhibitory control. Beyond behavioral strategy, traumatic brain injuries and neurodegenerative conditions are medical realities requiring physician or neurologist to manage physiological complexities. Alongside clinical care, we must fundamentally shift our support approach. We stop asking a patient to try harder, but instead we pivot to these questions. Where can we reduce unnecessary exposure to triggers so the system is not constantly under fire? And how do we build scaffold that supports regulation before emotional load hits? And how do we leverage their natural reward sensitivity rather than fighting against it? We manage the surroundings because the brain can no longer manage itself. So let's take a look now at the mechanism of wanting, reward, and compulsive behaviors. You might hear clients say things like, I don't even like it anymore, it doesn't feel good, or I don't even know why I keep on doing it. And you may hear it from someone whose drinking has already damaged their relationships, or someone who repeatedly returns to a painful relationship. And clinically, this moment matters because it tells us something really important has shifted in the underlying system maintaining the behavior. What this points to is a separation between two systems that normally work together, wanting and liking. Wanting, as mentioned, refers to the motivational pull toward the behavior or stimulus. And liking, by contrast, refers to the actual experience of pleasure or satisfaction once the reward is obtained. This involves different systems, including opioid and endocannabinoid processes. Under normal conditions, these systems tend to move together. We want something, we pursue it, and we experience it as rewarding. In addiction and compulsive behaviors, repeated exposure sensitizes the brain to cues linked to the behavior, places, emotions, routines, and anticipations begin carrying stronger motivational pull, making the behavior easier to trigger and harder to resist. Over time, the cues become stronger than the reward itself. So many people continue pursuing the behavior even when the pleasure is diminished. This is the core idea behind incentive sensitization theory. Behavior becomes increasingly driven by amplified wanting, even when the person is no longer genuinely likes or enjoys the outcome. This is why you may have clients who continue using substances such as cocaine, even when they're no longer experiencing the same high. This pattern also applies to any behavior that reliably shifts internal state. Gambling, online activity, shopping, eating patterns. As Alapi and colleagues note, the key factor here is not substance itself, but the reinforcing cycle of anticipating and state change. So when we move into a room with our clients, our focus has to shift to the conditions that precede the act. What is present just before the urge appears? What cues are reliably activating systems? And what do they see, smell, hear, or feel right before the urge arrives? And when the client says, I don't enjoy it anymore, you're not looking at inconsistency. You're looking at system where motivational drive and experience reward become part. This brings me to a distinction I want to draw clearly: impulse, compulsion, and behavioral loops. An impulse is a fast and reactive. It arrives before conscious thought and pulls the person toward the behavior with urgency they often cannot account to afterwards. A compulsion operates differently. It is repetitive, driven by the relief of internal discomfort rather than pursuit of pleasure. It often feels ego-dystonic. The person knows this is not what they want to be or do, and yet they do it anyway to quiet something internally. For example, someone might stand at the front door feeling increasingly uneasy and unable to settle, going back to check the stove again and again because the discomfort eases for a moment each time they do it. In practice, these systems don't just overlap, they feed each other. Most impulsive behaviors, repeated over time, eventually harden into compulsions. What begins as a sudden reactive impulse matures into mechanical compulsive relief. So as clinicians, we have to look closer. Understanding which system is currently dominant changes a lot about our intervention. Let's take a look for a moment at what we explored in our second part. We explored impulsivity as a movement toward immediate reward away from the discomfort, shaped by delayed discounting and the interactions between reward system and prefrontal control systems. We saw those processes reflected not only in psychopathology, but as well in traumatic brain injury, frontal lobe dysfunctions, and a number of neurodegenerative conditions. We also looked at compulsive behaviors and how they are often maintained less by pleasure itself, but more by amplified wanting, cue sensitizations, and attempts to regulate internal states. Importantly, impulsive behaviors tend to be rapid and reactive, where compulsive behaviors are repetitive and tension-driven, as well as relief-oriented, meaning that behavior alone is rarely enough without understanding the underlying function, emotional context, cues, and neurobiology driving it. So, if we were to step back, what may begin to emerge is how this system has been shaped over time, particularly during developmental window, where reward and regulation do not mature at the same pace. Let's take a moment to look into the developmental profile of impulsivity. So our brain does not mature uniformly. The striatum, the engine of reward processing, reaches functional maturity in early to mid-adolescence. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex does not fully consolidate until the mid-20s. It creates a developmental gap where reward sensitivity is at its peak, but the regulatory brakes are still under construction. In males, this gap becomes more pronounced in high arousal or competitive situations, especially when testosterone is associated with status seeking and dominance. This is a normal developmental window, but it is also a window of maximum vulnerability. When a client experiences adversity during these years, the gap can widen, and the consequences can extend deep into adulthood. And these differences are not shaped by environment alone. Behavioral genetics also reminds us that people do not all begin with the same regulatory sensitivities or capacities. For example, research on MAOAL variant, a low-form gene that regulates neurotransmitters such as serotonin, suggests it does not directly cause impulsivity, but it may create a greater vulnerability to emotional reactivity and reduce regulatory efficiency, particularly under stress. We also have to ask ourselves whether cognitive difficulties result from the behavior or partly predisposed. Peters and colleagues found that low working memory predicted the first alcohol use and binge episodes before drinking had even begun, suggesting that some impulsivity-related cognitive profiles may exist long before the behavior itself emerges, meaning our window for intervention may begin much earlier than what we typically assume. And similarly, regulatory differences also seen in neurodivergent profiles, particularly in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorders. Here, impulsive behaviors not always break down in control. In ADHD, the system is frequently under-aroused, so impulsive behavior may function to increase stimulation and maintain engagement. In in individuals with autism, the opposite pattern can emerge, where rapid or reactive behavior appear when the system becomes overloaded and attempts to reduce input or restore predictability. So across these presentations, impulsivity is closely tied to the state of the nervous system in that moment, which means that we are looking at a system that is trying to regulate itself, but within a different set of sensitivities and environmental demands. However, two clients with the same diagnosis can have entirely different impulsive expression, and this is where the UPPSP model becomes essential. UPPSP model, established by Whiteside and Lennon in 2001 and expanded by Siders in 2007, is a gold standard for understanding impulsivity as a collection of 5 distinct neurobiological pathways. It acts as a clinical translator, mapping clients' rash actions to the functional why behind them, moving us away from the generic labels toward targeted mechanism-based intervention. So to understand how this looks in practice, let's break down 5 pathways that make this framework. So first, let's take a look at positive urgency. This is the tendency to act impulsively during states of excitement, confidence, and emotional highs. You might recognize it in clients who receive good news and suddenly overspend, overcommit, or make major decisions that they would normally think through more carefully. In this moment, the emotional high overrides the usual safety checks. On the other hand, we have negative urgency, acting quickly to escape intense emotions such as anger, shame, anxiety, and distress. You often can see it in binge eating, emotional outbursts, self-destructive behaviors, or substance use, where the behavior function is a rapid attempt to shut down an unbearable emotional state. The third one is sensation seeking. These are clients who feel chronically understimulated and are drawn towards intensity, novelty, risk, and excitement. Clinically, it may look like high-risk gambling, impulsive investments, reckless driving, or constantly chasing stimulation simply to escape boredom. Number 4, we have lack of premeditation, a classic acting before thinking profile. Here, clients often understand consequences intellectually, but struggle to pause long enough for that knowledge to influence the behavior in the moment. And finally, we have lack of perseverance, difficulty sustaining attention and effort when the task becomes repetitive, frustrating, or unrewarding. This is often what sits underneath chronic procrastination, unfinished tasks, or repeatedly abandoning long-term goals once immediate reward disappears. Once we start mapping these impulsivity pathways, larger pattern begins to emerge. The question becomes, what experiences shape regulatory systems early in life? And here it's appropriate for us to talk about trauma, emotional maltreatment, and dysregulation. Here is an important finding for trauma assessment. While intake protocols often focus more heavily on physical and sexual abuse, Liu 2018 meta-analysis found that emotional abuse showed one of the strongest associations with impulsive outcomes, particularly negative urgency and lack of perseverance in the UPPSP model. In many cases, it is the chronic, pervasive nature of emotional maltreatment that drives dysregulation we later see clinically. The challenge is that for many clients, emotional maltreatment was not experienced as a single event, but as the atmosphere they grow up in. Constant criticism, shaming, unpredictability, emotional invalidation became normalized, which means that clients often minimize these experiences and do not recognize them as trauma at all. And when we identify that history, it allows for more powerful clinical reframe. It is often the first time the client sees their behavior as a strategy rather than a deficit. These findings help answer 3 core questions we ask in formulation work. Why impulsive patterns develop, why they persist, why relapse can occur in highly motivated clients. So when we look at the development, impulsivity emerges when a biological predisposition, like high emotional sensitivity, meets unpredictable traumatic environment during critical developmental windows. The behavior persists through negative reinforcement because impulsive acts provide immediate relief from distress and brain adopts them as automatic rather than conscious regulatory strategy. And falling back into old patterns is rarely a lack of motivation. Instead, it is a state-dependent regulatory failure where intense distress overrides high-level insights. So now, as we move into measurement tools and case reflections, I want us to consider this question. Why do 2 clients with the same diagnosis sometimes respond completely differently to the same evidence-based treatment. And here we are going to look at two clients who both meet criteria for intermittent explosive disorder. The first client is Mark. He was referred after shouting aggressively at a colleague during a meeting. His outbursts are highly interpersonal and usually follow moments where he feels criticized, dismissed, or disrespected. This is often noticeable. There is often noticeable build-up, rise in physiological arousal, cognitive narrowing, and increased urgency to respond. He describes growing up with a highly critical father, where mistakes were met with ridicule and humiliation. After the outburst, he experiences immediate relief followed by shame and attempts to repair. And let's take a look at Jason, referred after repeated complaints about yelling and property damage. Unlike Mark, many of Jason's outbursts alone often happen during prolonged periods of boredom and low stimulation, and usually late at night. The trigger itself can be quite minor, slow internet or background noise, dropping something, but the outburst rapidly shift him from emotional flatness to activation and stimulation. If we apply the same intervention, a DBT-informed protocol targeting impulse control through distress tolerance, urge surfing, and response delay, with Mark, we are going to see meaningful improvement because his outbursts are driven by high arousal, slowing the response directly targets the mechanism and reduces reinforcement cycle over time. And with Jason, the outcome is very different. Asking him to pause and to tolerate state can actually increase restlessness and behavioral pressure. Intervention using contingency management with immediate reward and high engagement behavior scheduling may be more effective because the goal is to increase stimulation rather than simply slow the response down. The intervention is the same, but the underlying mechanisms are not. This highlights an important clinical reality. Interventions do not succeed simply because they're evidence-based in general. They are more likely to succeed when they match the mechanism maintaining the behavior. And once we understand that mechanism, treatment changes. The work is no longer just that insight during a crisis, but upstream regulation before the crisis happens. We build structure, reduce cue exposure, strengthen routines, create more distance between urge and action using interventions matched to the specific impulsivity profile. So if Mark is trying to downregulate overload, Jason is trying to escape under stimulation. The question then becomes, how do we actually measure those differences in a clinically useful way? There are several well-established tools that helps us assess impulsivity more precisely. We have Barrett impulsiveness scales, and it breaks impulsivity into areas like attention, motor impulsivity, and non-planning, while Eisenach 17 begins separating acting quickly under pressure from stimulation-seeking behaviors. Clinically, one of the most useful models, UPPSP, is UPPSP because it measures mechanism, not just severity. Instead of simply asking, how impulsive is the client, we begin asking, under what conditions does this impulsivity emerge and what functions it's serving? This changes our work from simply managing a symptom to understanding the functional architecture of the client's internal world. And we are going to cover these measurement tools during our 5-day training. And just out of interest, how many of you during today's session have checked your mobile phone or scrolled or opened an app, maybe checked message or email? How many of you done it more than once? You know, even it's interesting to note that even in 1-hour session, it is difficult for us to resist an urge to scroll, or maybe we even do it mindlessly. It's interesting to note next time, how long does it take you to reach out to your mobile phone and start scrolling it? As we come close, I want to leave you with a central idea from Epictetus. The urge is not my fault, but how I respond to it is my power. Because ultimately the goal of this work is not perfection or total control. It is building a deeper understanding of the system driving the behavior, so we can respond with the greater precision, flexibility, and awareness. Throughout this hour, we looked at impulsivity shaped by reward sensitivity, emotional regulation, development, reinforcement, trauma, environment, nervous system state. We looked at why two clients with the same diagnosis can require completely different interventions. And hopefully what is becoming clearer for you is that impulsivity is not a superficial behavioral issue. It is a system issue. And once we start seeing it through this lens, our work changes quite drastically. As the goal is no longer simply to stop the behavior. The goal becomes understanding what function the behavior serves, what state nervous system is trying to regulate, and what conditions reliably activate the pattern, and what interventions actually match the underlying mechanism. And that level of formulation requires more than just insight into the theory, because the reality is, most of you are already using highly effective treatments like CBT, DBT, motivational interviewings, relapse prevention, mindfulness-based approaches. What changes here is the precision of this application. Over time, the work becomes very cognitive, compressed, and analytical. But impulsivity is not only cognitive. It lives in the body, it lives in the timing, in emotional load, and in nervous system activation. It exists in reinforcement patterns that emerge moment by moment, often outside of conscious awareness. Addressing that requires a different kind of learning environment. And shortly, we are going to send you a questionnaire and evaluation form. Once we receive your responses, we are going to send you your certificate. And I would like to thank you once again for your interest. I feel very passionate about this topic, and it looks like you are sharing this interest with me. Thank you for your time.
That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us and for being part of today's session. Your certificate of completion will be issued within 24 hours. The on-demand recording will be available within 24 to 48 hours and will remain accessible for 12 months. Thank you again for your time, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.